Okay, let's continue this lecture and talk just a little bit about the geologic timescale and fossil preservation. The geologic timescale is just the time scale that we have put together in our understanding, reading the rock record, of what has happened since the Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago. It's roughly the age of the Earth, and we get that from our absolute dating of the oldest possible samples we can find. So using certain isotopes with half-lives of around 1 billion years, we have figured out that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. We can also read different other events that have happened throughout the rock record. And reading when those events happen and when really major shifts on Earth have happened, we break down this geologic timescale a little further into pieces. The largest pieces that we break these down into are called eons. I want you to know that. The first eon on Earth's surface, there's probably no life, or at least very little, called the Hadean. And really, there was probably a lot of lava, probably a lot of bombardment by meteors still. So Earth's surface was still very much in flux then. We might not have even had stable oceans until near the end of the Hadean or the start of the Archean. The Archean represents when life has really started to influence Earth. So, life may have formed somewhere in here, we're not really sure when, but it really started to take hold right around the start of the Archean. Then the Proterozoic, we move into a little bit different life influencing Earth's surface. And then the current eon, I'd like you to know this, is called the Phanerozoic eon. So this represents all the time over which we have good fossils, lots of good fossils. And that's because we finally started to have organisms that were multicellular, so they have big fossils, and they have hard parts, so they're easier to preserve. Before this time, before about 540 million years ago, we really don't find fossils in rocks on Earth's surface because the organisms that were around weren't big enough. So we don't find whole fossils. We might find chemical remains of different organisms. Like we might go back in time and find evidence that there was chlorophyll around, which is the pigment that plants and cyanobacteria use to do photosynthesis. And so we find that, we're pretty sure that those cyanobacteria or the algae or whatever it was around. They just haven't been preserved as whole cells. Looking at this a little further, how do we break the Phanerozoic down? Well, it started about 540 million years ago. This is in millions of years. And we can break it down into certain eras, periods, and ultimately epochs. So you might want to be familiar with these names. The eons are the longest ones. The eras are next. The periods break up the eras, and then the epochs break up the periods. And you might recognize some of these, like if you've ever seen Jurassic Park, the Jurassic is one period in the Mesozoic era, which is part of the Phanerozoic eon, or Phanerozoic. We currently are in the Quaternary period. Sometimes there's some disagreement over whether that's part of the Neogene period or not. But I think most geologists that I see break it up into an entirely new period that started about 2 million years ago. That's part of the Cenozoic era. So we're currently in the Cenozoic era, which is also part of the Phanerozoic eon. Okay, so the time periods, the eras I would like you to recognize from the start of the Phanerozoic eon are the Paleozoic era, the Mesozoic era, the Cenozoic era. Paleo, does that sound like old? Meso, middle. Ceno, recent. Zoic, that prefix, like zoo, means life. So the Paleozoic really means old life. The Mesozoic means middle life. And the Cenozoic means recent life. Using that, you should be able to look at one of these eras and break down whether it's the older or the middle or the most recent one. That's the easiest way to memorize that. I do want you to be familiar at least with a couple of the periods. In Tennessee, we have a lot of Cambrian and Ordovician rock that's exposed, at least in East Tennessee. And that's part of the Paleozoic era. The Carboniferous period is the time, okay, it's got the word carbon in it. That's because a lot of coal formed then. You find a lot of carbon-rich coal deposits that were laid down because there were a lot of swamps during the Carboniferous and because fungi hadn't actually developed the way to break down cellulose. So a lot of trees and plants could build up in swamps. So that's why we would find big deposits of coal from the Carboniferous period, the Paleozoic era. The biggest mass extinction in Earth history was actually between the Permian and the Triassic, the Paleozoic-Mesozoic boundary. And there are 5 mass extinction events. I don't need you to know when they happened, but you should be familiar that the end Permian was the biggest. And this Cretaceous Paleogene, this is when the dinosaurs died off, that boundary between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. It's no coincidence that the mass extinctions tend to happen at the boundaries between eras or periods. That's because we used when those mass extinctions happened to define when eras and periods started and ended. They were major events, so we used them to define Earth's timeline a little bit. Jurassic, right? Dinosaurs. The Mesozoic is the dinosaur time. So the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous are all periods in which we might find dinosaurs. That movie, Jurassic Park, little ironically, most of the dinosaurs that you see in that movie came either from the Triassic or from the Cretaceous. And I believe it was mostly from the Cretaceous. So that really, it should have been called Cretaceous Park, but that sounds way less cool than Jurassic Park. So they went with Jurassic. And humans have really only existed in their modern form for, depending on how you define modern hominid, for a couple million years, or maybe only about 100,000 years, depending on how close to modern humans you want to get. So that happened at the end of the Cenozoic era. And I don't want you to have to remember all these different epochs, but you should know that we started with trilobites and fish and some weird organisms in the Paleozoic. Then we had a big mass extinction, and then we have dinosaurs, and then we have a big mass extinction, and then we have the time of mammals, really. It's our time. Until we have the next mass extinction event, which we may or may not cause. We'll see, or we won't, because we'll all be dead. Let's talk about fossil preservation. Fossils are really a pretty rare thing to be preserved. If they weren't rare, if everything that died became a fossil, our backyards would be stacked thousands of feet high, full of dead stuff. But that doesn't happen because organisms on Earth's surface tend to want to recycle the material that other life has used. It's probably useful for some reason. So they tend to try to break down the life that's there. As a result, most things that die at Earth's surface don't stick around. They get broken down. But rarely, very rarely, you can get organisms being buried fast enough, but gentle enough, without decomposing so much, that they get buried basically as they died. And then over time, particular chemical reactions will preserve them in those rocks for millions or hundreds of millions of years. The sorts of conditions that favor that happening are listed here. So fast, but gentle burial. You want to be buried with sediment so that you're not exposed at Earth's surface. A corollary to that, something that implies, right, is that the environment that you're in, because you need to be able to bury it with sediment, there must be a pretty large sediment supply. Sorts of places this might happen are like maybe on floodplains of winding rivers, or it might be in a delta or on the ocean floor, relatively near shore, but away from where the waves are going to break things down. So in benthic communities, you often get good fossil preservation. On somewhere like right on a beach, though, those waves, even though there's some sediment around, they're really not that kind to breaking things down. So you tend not to preserve fossils in like beach face sediments. It's also good to have anoxia, no oxygen. Bacteria use oxygen to do their life things, do their metabolism. So if oxygen is present, things tend to break down pretty well. When oxygen isn't present, it's better preservation conditions because bacteria aren't going to be able to break things down quite as fast. So that can happen in places like swamps, or again, places like the ocean floor. Another condition that favors preservation is related to the organisms being preserved themselves. When organisms have hard parts, not like skin, but like teeth, bones, and shells, those hard parts are much easier to preserve because they're much slower to break down. It's very rare to have fossils that have any preserved soft parts to them, but it's much easier to preserve things like bones and teeth. So let's talk about fossils and age dating. Species of organisms will evolve, they will come into existence, broken off of some other species that they've differentiated from, and then most of the time that species will eventually go extinct. They don't exist forever. Once they're extinct, they're gone. So these fossils that you see diagrammed on this diagram over here have certain ranges represented by these black bars. So this shelled organism called Macrospirifer, for example, lived only during this time period. That's what that black bar next to it represents. It only existed in the middle to late Devonian, and then went extinct sometime right around when the Mississippian started, which is part of the Carboniferous. Just saying those words so you hear them a couple times. And you can look over here to have a sense of how long ago that happened. So Macrospirifer came into existence maybe around 400 million years and then died off around 359 million years. How do we know those numbers? Because we've done a lot of work to correlate our absolute dates that we got before with when we find the fossils. The fossils themselves are really only good for telling us relative ages. But then if we combine those with our radioactive decay, we can get the absolute radiometric ages of these fossils. Because we've done a lot of work and we found Macrospirifer only in rocks between 400 and 359 million years old, we can say what its range was, and we can say probably how old a new rock is that we find that's got Macrospirifer in it. Some organisms exist for really long times, right? This bar here is for sharks. They started in the early to middle Devonian, and they're still around today. You can find shark teeth in rocks as old as 400 million years, or as, you can go find shark teeth on the beach today. They're not a very good fossil for telling us how old a rock is for that reason, because you don't know. Is it 400? Is it 300? Is it 200? Just by finding a shark tooth in there, you have no idea. But some organisms existed for only very short periods of time. Unlucky for them, lucky for us. These make good index fossils because they well constrain the age of host rocks. So Macrospirifer would be a pretty good index fossil because it only lived during part of the Devonian. Flexicalamine, another good index fossil because it only lived during part of the Ordovician. Neuropterus ferns, another good index fossil. These all have very short lives. Baculites, another good one. Just the existence of dinosaurs in general, less good index fossil. It tells you that it was in the Mesozoic era, but without knowing a little bit more about which dinosaur you're looking at, you're not quite sure. So dinosaurs in general aren't good, but a particular species of dinosaur might make for a good index fossil. Sharks, shark teeth, not a good index fossil. I want to give you a thought question here, because oftentimes we find rocks with more than one fossil in them. We can use all of the fossils in them to help us constrain the ages. So how old is a rock that contains Macrospirifer, Canides, and Phacops? You see the age bars here. How old would a rock be that contained all three? How can you use the ages of all of them to constrain the age of the rock? And ultimately, which of these fossils is the most helpful? So let's start with the widest age. Canides tells us that it could have been anywhere from the Silurian to the Permian. Doesn't help us a ton, right? Because it lived for a long time. then let's see where the age range of Phacops and Canides overlapped. Well, they started at roughly the same time, late Silurian, and then Phacops died off at the end of the Devonian, right? Canides could have kept living. Could the rock be of Pennsylvanian age? Well, the fact that it has Phacops in it means that no, it couldn't. We use the fact that we have Phacops and the fact that Pennsylvanian rocks would not have any Phacops in it to tell us that using those two fossils, we can constrain the age to just between the late Silurian and the end Devonian. Then ultimately, we use the Macrospirifer to help us constrain that further, and it's got to be within this whole window, the window of the Devonian, mid to late Devonian. It's the only time that a rock that contains all three of these fossils could have been from. So which one was the most helpful? The one with the shortest age range. Now I'm going to clear that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can use fossils that don't overlap everywhere. So let's say we had a rock that had Phacops and shark teeth in it. What do those two fossils, which don't overlap completely, what do those tell us? So the age range of sharks goes way on up all the way to today, but clearly it can't be a new rock because Phacops is present in it. Also, because shark teeth didn't exist all the way back then, it can't be as old as the Silurian because sharks only evolved during the Devonian. So in order to figure out how old that rock is, you just look for the region in which they overlap, right? We're looking at sharks and Phacops, so you're looking at where the shark bar and the Phacops bar overlap, and that's this region here. Most of the Devonian, but not the very earliest Devonian, because sharks hadn't evolved at the start of the Devonian. So that's the general way that you can use fossils to constrain the age of the rock. It constrains the relative age by itself, but then when you combine it with absolute ages that we have determined for a lot of these fossils that have been very well documented, we can get the absolute age of a rock, but only because we already have information from radioactive decay dating.